The Santiago Bernabeu Stadium was electric that evening, filled with 80,000 voices, creating a wall of sound that could be heard blocks away from the iconic arena. Real Madrid was hosting a crucial Champions League match, and the atmosphere was intoxicating with anticipation and passion. Cristiano Ronaldo stood on the sideline during a brief pause in play, adjusting his captain's armband and scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who had performed on this stage countless times before. But tonight, something would happen that would test not just his skills as a footballer, but his character as a human being. In the North Stand, section 127, a group of about 30 fans had been growing increasingly agitated as the match progressed. Their team was trailing by one goal, and frustration was beginning to manifest in ways that went far beyond disappointed groans or calls for tactical changes. Among the opposing team's players was Youssef Al-Rahman, a talented midfielder from Morocco who had been having an exceptional season in European football. His skill was undeniable, his work rate impressive, and his technique sublime, but none of that seemed to matter to the group of fans whose anger was taking a darker turn. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A few muttered comments that could have been dismissed as typical fan frustration. But as the second half progressed and Al-Rahman continued to dominate the midfield, controlling the tempo and creating chances for his teammates, the comments grew louder and more specific. The words began to carry beyond their immediate vicinity, spreading like a poison through nearby sections. "Go back to your desert," one voice called out during a brief lull in the crowd noise. "Terrorist," shouted another, emboldened by the anonymity of the crowd. The chants began to take on a rhythm, a coordination that suggested this wasn't spontaneous frustration, but something more organized and deliberate. Ronaldo first noticed it during a throw-in near the sideline. The usual cacophony of a football stadium has its own rhythm and flow, but there was something discordant cutting through the normal sounds of support and protest. His trained ear, accustomed to picking up tactical instructions from coaches over crowd noise, caught fragments of words that made his stomach tighten. At first, he tried to focus on the game, telling himself that security would handle any inappropriate behavior from the stands. But as play continued, the chanting grew more persistent and more vile. Other players were beginning to notice too. He could see Al-Rahman's shoulders tense slightly during dead ball situations. The way the young midfielder's usual confident stride seemed to falter just a fraction when the abuse was at its loudest. During a break in play for an injury, Ronaldo found himself close to the touchline where the sound was clearest. What he heard made his blood run cold. The group had moved beyond individual slurs to organized chanting, their voices harmonizing in hatred that echoed off the stadium walls. "Send them back! Send them back! Muslims are not welcome here," they sang with the same enthusiasm usually reserved for supporting their team. The irony wasn't lost on Ronaldo, that some of these same fans probably cheered when Real Madrid signed talented players from North Africa and the Middle East when it benefited their club. Ronaldo looked toward the referee, hoping for some intervention, but the official was focused on the injured player and seemed unaware of what was happening in the stands. The security staff appeared to be either oblivious to the situation or uncertain about how to handle it without causing a larger disruption. Meanwhile, Al-Rahman was trying to maintain his composure, but Ronaldo could see the psychological impact the abuse was having. The young player's touches were becoming slightly heavier, his decision-making a fraction slower, his usual flair constrained by the weight of hatred directed at him. It was in that moment that Ronaldo made a decision that would define not just the evening, but his legacy as something more than a footballer. Rather than waiting for officials to act, rather than hoping someone else would intervene, he chose to take action himself. During the next natural break in play, instead of jogging back to his position, Ronaldo walked deliberately toward the section where the chanting was loudest. The crowd's attention gradually shifted from the game to the unexpected sight of the world's most famous footballer approaching their section of the stadium. Security personnel looked confused, unsure whether to stop him or follow his lead. Ronaldo reached the barrier that separated the field from the stands and looked up at the group of fans who had been leading the racist chants. The stadium had grown noticeably quieter as word spread that something unusual was happening. Cameras zoomed in, broadcasters scrambled to understand what was unfolding, and 80,000 people waited to see what their captain would do. When Ronaldo spoke, his voice carried clearly in the sudden hush. He didn't shout, didn't gesture wildly, didn't resort to the kind of theatrical display that might have been expected. Instead, he spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "I want to tell you something," he began in Spanish, his voice calm but firm enough to reach the fans in the upper rows. "That player you're insulting, Youssef Al-Rahman, he's not just a footballer. He's a son, a brother, a human being who has worked his entire life to be here tonight. Just like me, just like you work every day to earn the money to buy tickets to support your team." The group of fans who had been so vocal moments before suddenly found themselves the center of attention not just from Ronaldo, but from the entire stadium. Some looked defiant, others appeared uncomfortable under the scrutiny, and a few seemed to be reconsidering their actions. "When I was young," Ronaldo continued, "I faced discrimination too. People said I was too small, too weak, that I came from nowhere and would never amount to anything. They mocked my accent, my background, the island where I was born. But football taught me that talent has no nationality, no religion, no color, only dedication, respect, and love for the game." The stadium was now completely silent, except for Ronaldo's voice carrying across the stands. Television broadcasts had switched to live coverage of his impromptu speech, and social media was exploding with clips and commentary. But in that moment, none of that mattered to Ronaldo. What mattered was the young player behind him who was representing his country with dignity, despite facing hatred. "Al-Rahman is here because he earned it," Ronaldo said, his voice growing stronger. "He's here because he's talented enough to play at this level, skilled enough to make your team work harder, good enough to earn your respect, not your hatred. When you insult him, you insult the sport we all love. You insult the values that Real Madrid is supposed to represent." Some fans in the section began to look around nervously, perhaps realizing how their behavior appeared when highlighted by their own team's captain. Others in nearby sections were nodding in agreement, and scattered applause began to build from other parts of the stadium. "I'm not going to stand here and lecture you about right and wrong," Ronaldo continued. "You're adults, you know the difference. But I will say this. If you can't support your team without hating someone else because of their religion or where they come from, then you don't understand what football is really about. Football is supposed to bring people together, not tear them apart." At this point, Al-Rahman himself had noticed what was happening and had jogged over to see what was causing the delay in the game. When he realized that Ronaldo was defending him against racist abuse, his composure finally broke. Tears began streaming down his face, not from the earlier humiliation, but from gratitude and surprise that someone he barely knew was willing to take such a public stand on his behalf. Ronaldo saw Al-Rahman approaching and gestured for him to come closer. In a moment that would be replayed millions of times in the coming days, Ronaldo put his arm around the shoulders of the opposing player and turned back to address the crowd. "This is what football should look like," he said, his voice now carrying to every corner of the stadium through the television microphones that had been directed toward him. Two players from different countries, different backgrounds, brought together by their love of the game. Respect for each other, not because we're the same, but because we're different, and that makes the game better. The transformation in the stadium atmosphere was remarkable. What had started as an ugly display of racism had become a moment of unity that transcended team loyalties. Fans throughout the stadium were on their feet, applauding not just Ronaldo's words, but the principle he was defending. Even many of the fans who had been participating in the racist chanting appeared moved by what they had witnessed. Some looked ashamed, others seemed to be genuinely reconsidering their actions, and a few were even joining in the applause. The referee approached to ask if play could resume, and Ronaldo nodded. But before returning to his position, he did something that surprised everyone, including Al-Rahman. He exchanged jerseys with the opposing player right there on the field, not after the final whistle as is traditional, but in the middle of the match as a symbol of respect and solidarity. The gesture sent a clear message to everyone in the stadium and watching around the world about what values mattered most. When play resumed, the atmosphere in the stadium had completely changed. The racist chanting had stopped entirely, replaced by a more typical football atmosphere focused on supporting teams rather than attacking individuals. Al-Rahman seemed liberated, playing with renewed confidence and flair, while Ronaldo led his team with the same intensity but with an additional sense of purpose. The match itself became secondary to what had transpired, though both players performed excellently for the remainder of the game. In the days that followed, Ronaldo's intervention became a global phenomenon. The video of his speech was viewed hundreds of millions of times, translated into dozens of languages, and shared by everyone from fellow athletes to world leaders. Educational institutions used it as a teaching tool about standing up to discrimination, while anti-racism organizations highlighted it as an example of how influential figures could use their platforms for social good. But perhaps more importantly, it sparked conversations in households, schools, and communities about prejudice, respect, and the power of speaking up when witnessing injustice. Parents used Ronaldo's example to teach their children about courage and compassion. Teachers incorporated the story into lessons about social responsibility. And football fans around the world began to reflect on their own behavior and the kind of atmosphere they wanted to create in stadiums. Al-Rahman later said in interviews that Ronaldo's intervention not only helped him in that moment, but inspired him to become more vocal about discrimination in football. The two players, despite being competitors on the field, developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences of overcoming adversity. Ronaldo never spoke publicly about why he chose to intervene that night, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But those close to him knew that it reflected the values instilled in him from childhood, that success means nothing if it doesn't come with responsibility, and that true greatness is measured not just by what you achieve for yourself, but by how you lift up others along the way. The incident also led to concrete changes. UEFA implemented stricter protocols for addressing racism in stadiums, Real Madrid enhanced their fan education programs, and other players across Europe began to feel more empowered to speak out against discrimination when they witnessed it. But beyond the policy changes and institutional responses, what mattered most was the message that night sent to millions of people watching: that hatred has no place in football, that courage can be contagious, and that sometimes the most important victories happen not when the final whistle blows, but when someone has the courage to stand up and say that certain things are simply unacceptable, regardless of the consequences.